Uphina kuphi emakhaya amadolobheni asentkomplasta khona sawubona ke mbukelo sakamukela ehlelo lakho ilungelo lakho it's your right. Bekunene luhlelo ke le debt counselling luhlelo ke lwalethwa phansi kemthetho we National Credit Act yanga 2005. I-debt counselling yona ke yalethwa ukuthi yehlise bumadima bemthwalo walabo ke labahluleka ukukhokha tikweneti. Kepha manje sengathi ke lolu hlelo luletha ke tinkinga kulabo labaphansi kwe-debt rehabilitation program. Kepha ngaphambi kokuthi ke sidzingithe indzaba yethu asesibathole nangumbiko.
Uwandiswa Ncuthe akayikholelwa into azibona igaxeleke kuyo. Uthi ubomi bakhe buminxi ukusukela mhla weva ukuba akanakuphinda akwazi ukuthenga nantoni na ngetyala. Intsusa ngumnxeba wangena efonini yakhe usuka kwinkampani ethi inceda abantu abanengxaki yemali okanye bohlulwa ngamatyala. Intombi kaNcuthe yatsolwa sisithembiso esithi baza kumcuthela imali abhatala yona qho ngenyanga.
Athi this lady, okay, Wandiswa, I have your information lana from consultant yethu. Uyatsho ukuthi uvumile ukuthi sizo consolidate la debts wakho and you'll be paying 5,000 rands per month instead of 7,000. Okay, athi I will send you a link, an SMS with a link where you must sign. Okay, but aren't you guys going to give me like a sort of a contract so that maybe I can read through it and whatever? I know everything, we've gone through it now. All you need to do when I'll send you this link and then you sign it. Do you have airtime? No, I don't have airtime. Because I'm thinking maybe if I say I don't have airtime, maybe she'll send me an email with a document and attachment or whatever. I'll send you airtime now. I've just sent you airtime and the SMS. Hi, Nyan. Ingenele SMS.
Kanti kulapho umgibe ufihlwe khona. Le SMS yayimyelela ukuba makacofe nje kuphela enye nenye angazikhathazi ngayo. Into wayifumana ingumnqa kungabikho kweenkcukacha malunga nemimiselo nemiqathanga yesisivumelwano. Wacofa ke.
A day later I get a SMS that says EYMA Consulting has contacted all my creditors and informed them about my decision to be placed under debt review. So that's when I'm thinking to myself, debt review. I don't remember talking to a person about debt review. And EYMA can't do their debt review company. Okay, immediately I phone. This I nalo mntu lo bekuthiwe mandiqane ngxaki ndithethe naye. Kuthe okay, ndimxelele lo mntu ndithethe naye ndithi hayibo. Guys, which company are you? What do you guys do exactly? Because you will consolidate all my debts. They didn't say anything about you guys being a debt review company. Because I don't need your services, guys. I've been paying everything now on time. I don't need your services. So why did you guys not disclose to me what you're a debt review company? And where did you get all this information from? Because this person knew how much am I paying each and every single month. And that's what made me gain a trust here, because I'm thinking nobody has that kind of information readily available to them.
Wawuya kubo esithi uqhathiwe enyanzelisa isithi mawurhoxiswe yonke into kwakungoJanuary ka-2021 ngoko. Kuna namhlanje uwandiswa usajonge enkalweni. Londo ithetha ukuba akanakukwazi aphinde ukuthenga nantoni na ngetyala de agqibe onke amatyala akhe. Iziko lilawula amashishini arhweba ngokubonelela abantu ngetyala kunye namashishini anceda abantu abantyumpa-ntyumpeka ematyaleni, i-National Credit Regulator ithi uwandiswa akayedwanga. Eli ziko lithi ube lixhobo lomkhuba oxhaphakileyo ukufakwa kwabantu kwinto ekuthiwa luphononongo lwamatyala, i-debt review ngolwasemzini. Amanye alamashishini awaziwa njenge-debt counselors aqhatha abantu ngolu hlobo. Aze athi ukuba ufuna igama lakho lisuswe kwi-debt review, hlawula isixamali esithile. I-NCR ithi akho mthethweni oko. Kumyalelo wenkundla kuphela onokukwazi kukukhupha kuloo ngxaki. Kweli xesha linzima abantu besinwa umthwalo wamatyala nantoni na ezangelithi iphethe isisombululo yamkelwa ngezishushu. Kodwa kufuneka ubani alumke hleze kuthi kanti kukho ubungozi xa kuthethwa nge-debt counselling.
Cha mina ngibona ingalunganga mfethu ngoba labantu bayigqebengu. Beke ubhadare imali emafonini abantu ngazi. Mina prepare ukuthi wazi ama-office wabo uye ema-officeini ohlale phansi nawenze over the phone ubugqebengu nje obunzima kakhulu lo benziwa lamlo. Ayilunganga nje lonto akumelanga nje ivume ngoba ugcina usegoleti uthi ikoleti zakho lezoyikhokhelayo ziyosala zinjalo after isikhathi oboma 2 years uzenza njani ekugcineni.
Ndibona uba umuntu xa inesikweleti uyakwazi ukuthetha uba ndinesikweleti endaweni eso. andinamali azibhatalele yena kancinci kancinci isikweleti side siphele, not uba aba bantu bathathe imali yam.
Ikhe ndive nje ereyidweni bethetha bathi ikhona indlela onganceda ngayo izikoloto ubhatale kancinci kancinci ungade uzibulale ngenxa yezikoloto.
Ngicabanga ukuthi bayenza into right if ba onex akusiyicam, but yeah, into right if the companies are legit.
Kubonakala kulula ukufika kulomgibe isimanga kunzima kakhulu ukuphuma kuwo. Ingabe imithetho ekhusela abathengi yenzelwe ntoni xa umkhuba onjena ugquba kangaka? Kuvisile Mdota, Yilungelo Lakho.
Hayisibonge ngalo mbiko ke manje khuluma kabanti ke ngelihlelo lwe-debt counselling asimukele kuvakashi tethu sina Madikwa Phoshoko lovela ke National Credit Regulator siphinde sibe nalisu Briati lobuya ke ehhovisi le-Credit Information Ombudsman. A very good afternoon to you too. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me.
Madikwa, I'm going to start with you. First of all, what's your comment to this case study we've just read, this insert?
You know, the biggest concern for me was that consumers so easily sign on links that they have no idea where they're going. So that's very concerning. You don't even know this person. You can't verify who they are, and you simply sign and send off your signature. You don't know where it's going to end up. And as much as, yes, they've got all your information, you should have questioned that first in terms of where did they get their information. So unfortunately, she fell into the trap, and now she's stuck with a problem that can be fixed. It's just that it's going to take a while to fix it. We'd need to investigate what really happened and to make sure that she is also put back in the position where she'd be able to participate in the credit market.
You know, Madikwa, most consumers find themselves being entrapped by these debt review companies because bona ke now sasakubuka bayabacabanga ukuthi batfola i-debt solution noma i-debt consolidation solution, yet in actual fact they are signing their lives away to be under debt review. Yini ke lo mehluko between debt consolidation and debt review?
So debt consolidation is when they group all your debts together and then they pay off your credit providers. This is normally offered by a credit provider themselves.
Okay.
So a credit provider would pay off lama debts on now and then consolidate those, and then you'd be paying then back the money. So in debt review, you still have all the debts under your name. So they're not consolidated per se. The only thing that's consolidated is that you're just paying one repayment to the PDA, which would be the ones distributing the monies to all your credit providers. However, isikweleti sakho is still under your name for all those credit providers. So I think it's a matter of understanding the concept and the wording that they use. Uguti, unfortunately, balahlekise abantu uguti, this is what we're offering, whereas it's not what they're offering. So it's just a play of words in order to miss.
Make me understand, Madikwa, debt consolidation. I thought, all along, I've always been thinking, and I know so many consumers out there, they thought Uguti is the best way out. You know, nangabe ubhatala sikweleti sinye, nangabe bona letting 6, but you had consolidator and pay one payment. But apparently it is problematic.
Look, with debt consolidation, number one, you're paying a higher interest on all the accounts that you've actually consolidated. So you find, Uguti, at the end of the day, the interest that you'd be paying on the consolidation loan versus what you would have paid individually on the creditors is more. So uthola ukuthi isikweleti beselling in 4 months to stay, but now you end up having to pay it for 5 years because the consolidation is for 5 years. So it's those type of technicalities ekumele uziqaphele mawuzongena into consolidation. Yes, you pressed at that time ukuthi ufuna ukuthi yazi ikweleti zehle, but you must look at ultimately the installment ozoyibhatala ne-interest versus what you currently have. Nokuthi izokusiza kanjani at the end of the day. Is it really working for you or against you?
Okay. All right. Let me also welcome Lee Subriati from the Credit Information's Ombudsman Office. A very good afternoon to you, Lee. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having us.
Is the debt review mechanism designed to enrich debt solution companies or protect consumers in its entirety?
I mean, we know with the National Credit Act, or rather with the coming into effect of the National Credit Act all the way back in 2007, it was meant to protect the consumer, provide the consumer with options. I mean, with a plethora of options available for the consumer. And what debt review does and is supposed to do is it's supposed to place a consumer in a better off position in order to manage their debt. Now, we know one of the fundamental requirements for you to qualify for debt review is that you have to be over indebted. And the debt counselor is the body or the trusted person that is supposed to assess your debt, your expenses versus your income, and qualify you as a person that is entitled to enter into debt review. Now, that's a bit of a sort of a loaded question, because what I can say is that if the process is managed correctly, if the customer is kept abreast of what is happening, what the expectations are, and one of those expectations are essentially that once you enter into debt review, you essentially are taken out of the credit market. That means you can't be granted any further credit. Your name is listed on the credit bureau as being in debt review, and that can come with it adverse effects. But at the same time, the benefits of it is that it puts your creditors at bay. As long as there's an agreement between your creditors and the customer, it's a solution that can work very well for both parties, provided it is handled correctly. From what I heard previously in the testimony from the previous consumers, is that they weren't given enough information. The foundation, or rather the provisions of what was agreed to, was supposed to be agreed to, was not explained to them. And I can't agree with my colleague more in that a customer has the responsibility to ensure that they understand what it is they are signing before they commit themselves to it. So it's more of a question is, how is the process handled? And if the process is handled in a responsible way by responsible parties, you can only have a responsible result. But in this situation, if you are taken advantage of, you as a customer need to ensure that you're protecting yourself, but not putting your pen to paper in situations where you're unfamiliar or do not understand the terms and conditions that come with it. Whether it's consolidation, debt review, or any other mechanism, it's important that you understand what you are binding yourself to.
Before we get deeper into the conversation, let's first start by differentiating between consolidation and debt review. What's the difference?
Okay, from our experience, remember with the Credit Information Ombudsman, we regulate information held at the Credit Bureau and non-bank credit agreements. Now, a consolidation note is exactly like my colleague mentioned earlier. It's essentially taking your smaller debts, and sort of putting them together and saying, listen, my total debt, for example, let's say I have 5 different credit agreements and loans amounting to a total debt of 20,000, and I'm paying multiple installments of, let's say, 5,000 rands a month as an installment. So consolidation debt is essentially granting to the consumer that 20,000 in essence, so that they can pay off the various creditors, and therefore you bundle your agreement in terms of which you're owing one creditor, the one installment, which can be less than that 5,000. In fact, it's meant to free up disposable income for yourself. But again, it doesn't change your status as a consumer. You are still regarded as a debtor to that one credit provider, and it's essentially taking your minor credit providers and combining them so that you just pay one person. Debt review or debt counseling, on the other hand, changes the whole dynamic. It changes your whole situation and status as a customer. It's a sort of avenue that's presented by the National Credit Act, so that you can voluntarily enter into it, but at the same time, your creditors are sort of compelled to at least hear to what you say. They're compelled to hear the debt counselor to say, listen, this is my outstanding debt. The credit provider is compelled to provide the COBs, or certificate of balances, and it's a discussion and negotiation that goes on to say, listen, what can we reduce the installments to so that the customer can free up income? So in essence, the effect that it has on disposable income may be quite similar in many instances, but from a regulatory point of view, they are very different, and they are very separate mechanisms that apply to each one of them.
So how many customers or consumers have complained about this? I mean, what are the kind of cases that you've had to deal with?
So from the credit ombudsman, remember, we regulate the credit information. So as I said earlier, is that when a customer or when a consumer is declared over indebted, and whereby the debt counseling has been accepted, and whereby the notice has been sent to both the credit providers as well as to the National Credit Regulator, that customer is then listed at the Credit Bureau as being under debt review, which means their credit profile is actually affected, which means they can't be granted any further credit. Anybody doing a credit check on them, be it for either insurance, a service agreement, or even a credit agreement, will know that that person is under debt counseling, and it's meant to signal a flag to say, listen, this person is over indebted, don't grant them for the credit, sort of thing. Now, where we're stepping is where customers are having difficulty in updating that information by removing it, where the debt counseling process has been successful or where they have withdrawn successfully from the process, in that instance, the credit ombudsman steps in to ensure that your information is reflected correctly. Now, when it comes to debt counseling disputes, either disputes regarding the conduct of the debt counselor or the debt review process itself, that has to be investigated directly with the National Credit Regulator, is because the debt counselors are registered with the National Credit Regulator to act in that capacity. So those disputes have to be sort of directed towards the NCR so that they can be adjudicated upon and investigated thoroughly.
All right. Now, Madigo, have any steps been taken to ensure that consumers are protected against being entrapped by debt review?
Look, we do a lot of workshops in terms of educating consumers to make sure that they are aware of what their rights and responsibilities are and how they should handle these calls. We've all received the SMSs at some point or another, an email saying that, are you interested or not? So it's really up to the consumer to be aware of what they're doing. So as much as we can do outreaches and try and communicate the message, which we do, we've got an education department that is always on the ground in different communities daily to make sure that consumers are aware of their rights in terms of the NCA and in terms of what debt counseling is about and what they should be aware of.
Okay. Hi, Gambugeli, asasisishilele ngasetitolo. Please do join us after this break. Namhlanje sikhuluma nge-debt review nange-debt consolidation. Leli Yilungelo Lakho. Sanibukela ke bekunene tincingo tethu sethivulwe ukuthi nawe ungaba ingcenye lenkulumo yethu ungashayela icingo lapha ke e-studio ku 01171469118 noma ke ku 01171469119 ungasithumela futhi ne-email ku consumer@sabc.co.za ungaphinde usifole futhi na ku Facebook. The numbers are on the screens right now. We are waiting to take your call to hear what you have to say or maybe share any stories that you may have about debt review or debt consolidation or even debt counseling. Now, Madigo, just off camera and during that ad break, we were just talking about how easy or how enticing it is to get a consolidation. Say, for instance, a consumer has about 7 debts and amounting to maybe 8,000 rand. But after a debt consolidation program, he ends up paying about 4,000 rand. So he has like 4,000 rand into his pocket, but not knowing the bigger cost.
Yes, the thing is with debt counseling and debt review is that you need to be aware that if you're paying less money, it extends the period that you're paying for. And you also need to consider whether the credit providers will be giving concession in terms of their interest. Some credit providers are willing to take down the interest a bit, but some are not. So ultimately, you need to be aware that you're putting back that 4,000 rand into your pocket, yes, but how long is it going to take you now to pay off the debts that you already have? The 100 rand that you could have paid off in 2 months, now you end up having to pay over 6 months or a year because you've reduced the amount that is actually going towards that creditor. And most consumers get frustrated with the process because now they're thinking, why is this thing not finishing? But you're forgetting that you were comfortable in the beginning to have that 4,000 rand back in your pocket.
One may argue that, I've got extra cash in my pocket to make an investment to try and, try to deal with this bigger debt.
How much are you getting back in that investment versus how much you're actually paying in terms of the interest that you're being charged with the creditors? So that's where you need to actually evaluate whether you're getting your money's worth or not. So you need to be careful and just really think about it before you sign. So before you sign any documents, before you send off your statements and you give them your banking details, just make sure that it's going to be to your benefit. If you calculate it and say, okay, after I've saved this much, this is my installments, this is my interest, is it going to be worth it? And if they're paying less than the interest that you actually are being charged, you're even worse off. So it doesn't really work.
Not at all. Now, Lee, why is it so simple to get into a debt review? I mean, does the credit laws favor the debt review companies over the consumer?
So remember, the National Credit Act creates requirements before you can be declared over-indebted. I mean, what happens, and let's take an ordinary customer in any sort of situation that's finding themselves to be over-indebted. The process is essentially that they go and approach a debt counseling company, or they may get a cold calling and say, listen, debt review company. We want to offer and see what your options are. Number one, what the consumer needs to do is that they need to confirm that the person that they're dealing with is legitimate. If it's a legitimate business registered with the National Credit Regulator to act and to conduct business as a debt counselor, then what happens in that situation is that the debt counselor is to assess the income and expenses of their customer to see whether or not they qualify to go under debt review. So remember, like I said previously, it's a balancing act. It's taking what the debt counselor knows and balancing it what the customer knows. It's an exchange of information, and that is why any customer that's willing to go through the process, they have to do their homework first. It's a necessary requirement. You have to ensure that the person that you're dealing with is legitimate. Always request documentation before you sign anything. Now, in this process, when you apply for debt counseling, you sign a Form 16. That form essentially is a form it's your application for debt review, where you assess your expenses and your income and so forth. Make sure you ask questions, you understand the process, you understand the costs that are attached to it, as well as the consequences on your ability to conduct yourself as a customer in the credit world. And that will limit your expectations. So I don't think it's more or less a question as to whether it's in favor of debt counselors. I think that it's a mechanism that has been created. The NCA creates requirements and limitations upon what a debt counselor can do. It's up to the customer to inform themselves and ensure that they are practicing their rights in terms of the National Credit Act. And if they have any concerns, they can reach out to the bodies like the National Credit Regulator and get further information, especially when it comes to registration or confirmation of registration, so that you're not sort of scammed, like the previous consumer mentioned a few minutes back.
You've made an example of an over-indebted customer or consumer. Are you talking of a solvent customer here, or is it two different dynamics? I mean, can a solvent customer get into debt review?
Yeah, well, remember, the law of insolvency and debt review are two totally separate things, right? The law of insolvency and being declared insolvent can either be voluntary or it can be done by your creditors, but it's a totally separate application that's different from the National Credit Act. The National Credit Act creates this mechanism where you as a customer go voluntarily to apply, say, listen, if you have 10 creditors, it's essentially making an appeal to these 10 creditors through your debt counselor, which is your agent. Remember, they're supposed to represent your interests. They're supposed to represent the ability to put you in a better off position from a financial point of view, because essentially you want to enter this process and you want to finish it in 5 years' time, and you want to walk away debt-free, essentially, from the debts that you found yourself over-indebted in. So remember, it's a totally separate application from an insolvency application, and this mechanism in terms of the National Credit Act provides you with that option of finding that balance between affording your debts and coming out of debts by a mechanism that has been created specifically to protect you. And as long as that mechanism is followed, you will be protected. But if in instances whereby you approach companies that are not reputable and where you have been taken for a ride, essentially, what will happen if the requirements of the Act are not followed, you're going to essentially think you're under debt review now, and 2 months' time or even 10 days later, you might get calls from credit providers saying, listen, you haven't paid us, but you're under the assumption that you're already under debt review. So it's very important that you deal with a reputable company, and you do that by ensuring that you speak to the National Credit Regulator to ensure that you are dealing with someone who has the ability to protect your interests, because that is what this process is supposed to do. And where you feel you're not being protected, immediately that should raise alarm bells, and you should contact the regulator for further assistance.
All right. Now, Madigo, under what circumstances can I be declined or denied credit? Is it when I'm under debt review, or if I have a consolidation program? I'm under a consolidation program.
If you're under consolidation, obviously you can still go on and get credit. If you're under debt review, you won't have access to credit because you're already over-indebted.
Okay.
So it's a matter of knowing where you stand. And should an application be rejected, you always, as a consumer, have the right to ask, why am I being declined, so that you can fix that. So you'll be rejected under debt review because you find that maybe, number one, you need to have income, obviously, to be in debt review.
Sure.
So they will assess the income versus what your expenses are, and taking that into consideration, they'd need to look at whether the process would work for you as a consumer. So if the debt counselor finds that after you've actually covered all your monthly expenses, you're still unable to have any money available to pay the debt review, and you're not willing to change, or it's impossible to actually make any other adjustments, especially with a lot of people having had pay cuts, then chances are it will be rejected. Or you find that you've got a lot of, most of the accounts already have legal action, and it's not feasible. If an account has already got illegal action, it won't be included under debt review. So a proper assessment needs to be done for the debts in order for the debt counsellor to come up with an assessment and saying, okay, based on the assessment, this is what the outcome is. They can take you under debt review, or they've actually rejected your application based on that.
Point taken. Please don't go away. We're still waiting to take your call. Namhlanje sikhuluma ke nge-debt review kanye ke ne-debt consolidation. Kuthi i-debt consolidation nangabe ke unetikweleti letinengi uthi shwaba kanye kube sikweleti sinye. Bathi ke bochwephesha ke lokho ke kutaba inkinga ngoba kutakhama emva kwesikhathi lesi kanye ke how to protect yourself from getting into a debt review is what we're discussing today. So please take up your phone and call the numbers on your screens right now. Leli Yilungelo Lakho. Asinimukele ke bekunene hlelo lakho Yilungelo Lakho, it's your right. Uhlelo ke losombulula ke tinkinga ke debathengi lapha eNingizimu Afrika. Welcome back. The numbers to call are 0117146918 and 0116714619. The numbers are on your screens right now. They are our participation lines. Please do call us. Ube ingcenye yale nkulumo yethu. You can also email your thoughts to consumer@sabc.co.za or interact with us on our Facebook page. And we've got our first caller, Sina Nomadala ulapha ke kwaMhlanga. Sawubona hlene sawubona.
Sawubona bhuti.
Siyaphila kakhulu baba. Ekhuluma nathi baba. What's on your mind?
Ukhuluma noMadala.
Khuluma nathi baba.
Ya, mina nginenkinga la. Bakhona abantu laba bangifonela bangibuza ukuthi ngama-account wami. Bengibatshela ngithi no mina nginenkinga yama-account. Yibe bathi no ukuthi nika ID yakho sifuna ukukucheckela. Ngabanika le ID yami. Then from there kanti labantu bona bethi all of a sudden uma ngithi ngifuna ukuthenga bathi no you are under debt review. Angifuna ukuthi ngifake ngibobani bathi ngimiya and associate. Then I called them ukuthi nengisuthini lapho mina nginankinga yokubhadala isikweletu sami. Bathi no we want 6,000 ukuthi sikhiphe la and anginankinga yesikweletu mina.
Manje nabathatha ama-details akho nema-ID number khona lwakusayina?
No, angiyasayina kanti bangifonile. Angiyasayina kanti.
Kwendeka nje over the phone?
Yes.
Okay baba, siyabonga kakhulu ukusishayela. Madala there is from kwaMhlanga in Mpumalanga. I'd love you to comment on that.
Look, as soon as you send through documents, you always run a risk of somebody doing what they want with those documents. So sending through your ID copy, unfortunately, Madala, that was one of the mistakes I did because Monsieur check, normally we check did the consumer actually provide the documents that are required now apply for a debt review.
Yeah.
So, but the debt counsellor had a responsibility to cancel immediately. Magafona ambuzuti, but I didn't apply anything right. I can pay my debts myself. And also, we need to check what services they provided because yes, debt counselling in my fees that are being charged, but it doesn't make sense for a consumer uputi patali 6,000 rand, whereas he didn't actually number one request those services and he didn't need those services. So, bam charge for in keep away as agasfaganga to start with. So it's something that we would need to investigate to make sure the debt counsellor themselves did they follow the process correctly? And if they didn't, we can deregister the debt counsellor for such acts. So it's up to the consumer to report the matters to the NCR in order for us to investigate the complaint and make sure they're protected and if we can remove them if the proper process wasn't followed.
And just picking up on Baba Madala's case, what's the normal procedure here? Should the consumer approach the debt counsellors or should it be the other way around?
It's the consumer who must approach the debt counsellor. Nobody knows your state of finances. Besides you disclosing it to them. So
no,
my first question would be, and it's I also get my calls, where did you get my information? Because I did not at any point consent to my information being shared. I've never said who is the debt counsellor in that company? Please make sure they actually remove amagama abantu who haven't actually voluntarily asked to contact. So it's important for the consumer to go to the debt counsellor because if you go to the debt counsellor, you know exactly where the office is and where you're going to find them at the end of the day. So if you can't do that and you've done it over the phone, how are you able to correct the process? And at some point you're going to want to sit down with somebody. It's a personal thing, equality, you know. It's somebody helping. Equality is very sensitive, so it's not something to be taken lightly and just do over the phone as if it affects you in more ways than you can imagine.
Yeah. Now, Lee, I want you to comment on that as well. Just picking up on what Madigo has said, isn't it time that this space is regulated in terms of ensuring that consumers' information is protected? Because so many consumers have approached me that with the implementation of the POPI Act, they still get calls from this dreaded 087 number. So what should happen then in case that happens if a consumer is approached by a debt counselor with all the information that is actually accurate?
So I think further investigation will need to be made as to what information they have. I mean, personal experience, now and again, you get that odd call, like you're saying, from that 087 number, asking open-ended questions. Are you in debt? Do you need assistance? Do you need your debt to be reduced or free up disposable income? You know, at that point, they don't have too much of information aside from your contact number. But if you are receiving calls from a person informing you, listen, we see you have a home loan of 3 million rand and you've got a car outstanding of 850,000 rand, you know, can we help you? Surely that should ring alarm bells immediately. And then at that point, remember, there are mechanisms for you to flag yourself as being a victim of either identity theft or identity fraud. You know, there are mechanisms for that. But remember, and from what I take from the previous consumer who called in, he gave out his information to, I'm assuming, a person portraying to be a debt counselor. And the important thing is that don't share any information, especially of a personal nature, unless you're sure that you're entering into a valid agreement, a valid contract. Now, we know that with POPIA and the protection of personal information, they need your consent to first of all, deal with your personal information and share your personal information. And if you are receiving calls from companies requesting for them to assist you or making or asking further questions, are you over indebted? Do you need assistance? Maybe request that they remove your name from their list of names or from their list of names that they have, whereby they call consumers, and you have every right to do that. And again, if you are not having any sort of success, reach out to regulators, reach out to authorities so that these companies can be brought to task. Unfortunately, the sooner consumers come together and start reporting these organizations, I think slowly we start to get to that place whereby we start bringing or closing down these institutions that portray or rather that are acting under false pretenses. And the sooner we get to deal with, obviously, with legitimate companies to assist consumers rather than to take advantage of them.
All right, thanks for that point, Lee. Let's take our next caller. Sinathembeka ulapha eJamiston. Sakumele ehleleni sabona.
Sawubona baba kunjani?
Siphilile ma kunjani?
Ndiyaphila ukusenothembeka eJamiston. Baba nami le problem ndinayo.
Yeah.
Yendikolota ngisho 2016 ngisebenza waphela umsebenzi ndinesikoloto sami se-African Bank ese-4,000 sendisikhokhile. Ndathola futhi umsebenzi. Mama ndifuna uyobhadala e-African Bank bathi ikwintontoni. Andayinaka ndahlala yafika i-call ndisho bekulast year. Mayifika le call bathi bayi-DMC sisikoloto sami esase-African Bank. Ini azange ngisayine nto ndababuza ama-office bantshela ukuthi ase-Eastern Cape. Ndabanikeza ama-details wami wasebhenki aba bantu laba. Bayithatha imali yami nange-15 imali amayingena. Ndahamba eCapitec ngicela ukuthi inisuwe lesikoloto. Mayivula iCapitec ayisakwazi usula bavalile. Mama ndiba emailele this year ndafaxa akuphendulwa nto.
Ngeyani le mali bayithatha? Is it the initial creditors?
Ibi credit.
No ngisho kona uthi le mali bebayithatha ngeyani nabasho bona?
Bebathi kuyi credit yesikoloto sami esase-African Bank.
Okay, all right, Thembeka, sema kakhulu kushayela ke. Yeah, it's a case that has been that has confronted so many consumers here in South Africa. So ungashare umbono wakho uthini lapho, Matiko?
I think what happened with this caller the African Bank, so they probably handed her over to AMA attorneys to do the collection.
Okay.
And then AMA attorneys added their own fees because they for collection fees and for, so there's other fees that attorneys add. So I think that's what they were collecting. However, obviously she needs to check who the attorneys are. She can go back to African Bank. They will tell her, we've handed it off to AMA attorneys, Anje, or maybe they have actually sold that debt to somebody else in order to do the collections for them. But she should be able to get lawyer information from the African Bank directly. It doesn't sound like it's a debt counseling, debt review matter that she's having.
All right. Siyabonga kakhulu ke kwenda lelo phuzu lethu. Buke, let's take another break. Uhlala nathi ngwasanyakati. Leli Yilungelo Lakho. Asiphinde samukele futhi bantu abakethu ke ehleleni Yilungelo Lakho, it's your right. Khumbula ke bekunene ukuthi ke tincingo tethu solo tivuliwe ukuthi ungasishaya lapha e-studio ku 011-714-6918 noma ke 011-714-6919. Again, you can email your thoughts about this show, about any other consumer issue to consumer@sabc.co.za or catch us on our social media platforms. We've got an anonymous caller from Durban. Sagumole ehleleni, sawubona baba.
Sawubona baba, njani?
Siphilile baba, kunjani?
Hayi siyaphila mfowethu. Udaba lufishane. Ngikhathaza ekuthenini ngo-2017 nga-approachwa ama-debt counselors from Cape Town. Where ke ngabe ngikhokhela imoto ne-African Bank futhi ke ingenayo inkinga ngikhokha kungabi nankinga. Inkinga kwawukuthi ke ngisanemali encane so bang-approacha ke nami ngavuma-ke. So 3 months down the line African Bank complain athi manje sekunama-areas ngingazi kanjani angaziqhamukaphi. Wena ke leli ngiphathe kabuhlungu mangibafonela bethi nobona bakhokha abazi inkinga ikuphi lethi iqhubeke uthi ngo-2018 bashintshe kungenabanye besethi bangisiza ngcono kulenkinga ngibhekene nayo. Hayi nangapela nabo bangabi nasithini okuthe ngo-2020 ngathi ngicela ukuphuma nje ngikhokhele mina ngathi abangeze incwadi into i-7W ukuthi ngikhokhele mina ngingakhokhelwa yibona. Right now phela bangiyezi incwadi bangenzela ngaphuma ezandleni zama-debt review debt counselors sort of like ngayikhokhela mina uzobe manje ngikhokhela mina ika-Toyota imoto ngikhokhela mina na-African Bank ngikhokhela mina. I-problem isekuthenini-ke uma ngifuna ukuvula ikweletu angikwazi ukuyivula ngoba manje kuthiwa isarijiswe phansi ka-NCR. Manje umbuzo uthi why ama-debt counselors engakhuluma no-NCR ukuthi bangikhipha ngoba sengikhokhela phela mina ngisakhokhelwa yibona angisekho phansi kwabo. I-problem isekuthenini manje angikwazi ukuqhubeka nezinto kumanje umfana wami uyekile esikoleni nge-university ngenxa yokuthi angikwazi ukuthola imali futhi ngiboleke imali ngikhokhele esikoleni ngoba kuthiwa mina ngiblokiwe sephansi ka-debt review. So i-program sekuthenini kumele ngenze njani ngoba phela manje sengifuna abameli abazongisiza ukuthi babangilwele enkantolo ukuze phela manje ngikwazi nami ngikhululeke ngoba vele ngiyayikhokhela. What's the use of me to be under debt review whereas bengakwazi ukungisiza?
Okay, Anonymous in Durban samakhulu kushayela, and I guess ukuthi igama le NCR vele it pops up so many times especially by these companies. Ukuthi ke under what circumstances would a relationship between NCR and a debt counsellor be feasible?
There's no relationship between the NCR and the debt counselors. We just regulate them and make sure that they comply. So they run their business and make sure that they service the consumers properly, and we check that that is done.
Ngoba nang Anonymous phela uthi nje hey bamtshele nge-NCR yena.
Yeah, so what happened now is that the consumer was under debt review already, as he did say. And then inkinga kuthe makafuna ukuphuma. And according to the Act, you can't exit debt review until you've paid off all the debts that are under debt review.
Yes.
So what happened is basuspende ama-services wabo. So he is still flagged as being under debt review on the credit bureaus. So until he has finished ukubhadala zonke lezo ikweleti, he'll still be under debt review.
Okay.
So he needs to make sure ukuthi uyaqeda. The other option that he can look at is, depending where he is in the process, he can go and have that application by the magistrate court ukuthi rejected. So he will need an attorney. But that's another process where we're not sure if that attorney is going to be honest and if he knows what he's doing. So it's a bit of a tricky situation where he would actually need to find umuntu azi. So he can get it rejected if there isn't a court order. If there's a court order, he just needs to pay it off.
Okay.
And he will still need a debt counsellor under debt review because they're the only ones who can issue a clearance certificates for the debts that were under debt review.
Sure. But then in hindsight, should a creditor verify a claim by a debt solution or a debt review company that their client is actually on debt review? Who bears the onus of making that verification?
What normally happens is that when the consumer has applied for debt review, it's flagged on the credit bureaus. So the credit providers normally have access to check. Most of them do check because they can pull the credit report. So if they're not flagged some will say after receiving the notification of the application that the consumer, however, is not flagged on the credit bureau. Therefore, what's going on? Is this a legitimate claim or not? Because when a consumer applies for debt review, the credit providers need to be notified negotiator na debt counselor on behalf of the consumer. So a debt counselor doesn't work in isolation from the process. It needs both parties to make the whole process work. Otherwise, consumers just paying less without actually having communicated right. They're actually having a problem. So a debt review will assist you, yes, if it's done properly.
Okay. All right, let's take another caller. Sina Zolisa ulapha ke Matatiele sakumoto ehleni sabona.
Yes, kunjani mama?
Siphilile kunjani mama?
Siphilile. Uzolisa lo ndine problem apha nani bathi ukweleti ngena kwi debt review hyphen debt review. Then when the time goes on, I was able to pay all my debts on my own. Then the problem enginayo ngokuthi ngiphuma kanjani kule debt review elangena kuyo. Last month, it was in February.
Were you aware with debt review?
Yes.
Okay, you were aware. Okay.
Then, what to do. Before me, like company MDR, which is DHU Department Debt Review Removal. Yeah, tell me, so that ingakwazi ukuthi indlelefele ilantuka indipatale ibona so that they can be able to clear my name we clear don't for ilantuka whatever but to clear my name so that we credit I don't know. Then if a company endiyicholile angayibhatali izawuqala i-first installment ngo-April. Tomorrow, the 20th, a sum of 1,500 for 3 months, which will make 9,000. Thereafter, they will be able to clear all my name from debt review. Because ngifuna ukuthi ngiphume ngokwinto ye-debt review njengasengikwazi ukuthi ngibhatale zonke izikweletu zami.
Okay, Zolisa, please stay tuned to SABC 1 Yilungelo Lakho ngoba ke impendulo itawuqhamuka emva kwalo kwanyalo asesithathela ukhefu sizaphinde sibuye khona nyalo. Welcome back to our very final segment. Saqhubeka futhi nenzaba yethu namhla sikhuluma nge-debt review kanye ke net-debt consolidation. Now, Lee, unfortunately, we are out of time, but in the remaining minutes that we have, I want us to talk about whether a creditor bears the onus to verify a claim by a debt review company or debt solution company that their client is actually under debt review.
I mean, credit providers, I'm sure that they have a compliance division that actually does this. So remember, in the debt review, in the debt counseling industry, the credit providers know each other. They know the debt counters, the sort of regular debt counters that continuously send applications to them. So yes, we know that a credit provider cannot just disperse information about a consumer, because remember, when the debt counselor contacts them with the information, the debt counselor is informing the credit provider to say, listen, we have an instruction from a customer who's applied for debt counseling. The application has been successful. Please, can you give us a certificate of balances and any information relating to the credit agreement? So a credit provider will not just give that information unless certain boxes have been ticked, and that is an undertaking from the consumer, an application from the consumer, a notification that we know as a form 17.1, giving them the sort of confirmation that this customer has in fact applied for debt for debt counseling and debt review. So yes, there are measures in place for them to double check these things and ensure that they are being compliant. But like we know that we get many consumers where these sort of cases fall through the cracks, whereby they get represented by information that's either been leaked out sort of unintentionally or been obtained through unreliable resources. So it's important for consumers.
Just to interrupt you there, Lee, unfortunately we're out of time, I beg your pardon, but can a creditor challenge the placement on debt review of a consumer or a client?
Well, it's yes, they can at court. So when the application is made at court, nothing is stopping from a credit provider to refuse an application on the basis that they feel that the consumer is not over indebted. Yes, they can at court.
Okay, great. Thanks for making that point. Madiko, just before we wrap the show, we had a caller there, Zolisa, ukhuluma ngekuthi namanje Zolisa usabhadala imali lekangayadi.
Okay, from what I could pick up from her, she's done paying off zonke ikweleti zakhe. So she just needs to get wonke ama paid up letters and then put them together and then approach a debt counselor to say, now my paid up letters wabi where these accounts were under debt review, and the debt counselor will actually issue a clearance certificate. She does not need to be paying somebody that amount of money to be cleared from debt counseling. We have guidelines in terms of how much can be charged, so she shouldn't be charged such an exorbitant amount in order to be removed if everything
Which
has
means
been
removing
paid.
a client or a consumer from debt review is illegal at this particular point.
It depends where they are in the process and what the situation is, but what she explained sounds a bit dodgy. Whoever's helping her is just pocketing the money, and they probably won't even remove her name.
Okay, so where does the client or the consumer pay the money? Like, who's supposed to debit? Is it the debt solution company?
So the debt counselors are not allowed to distribute the funds. What the person who distributes the funds is the payment distributing agency on behalf of the consumer. The consumer signs a mandate with the PDA to debit the account that was agreed upon when negotiating with the credit providers, and they disperse the money and distribute it according to the proposal that was done.
Matiko Poshoko and Lee Subriati, lovely chatting to you too. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Let me thank our guests for making time to be with us on the show today. When we bring you yet another live consumer affairs discussion. From Ms. Mpiwe Ngongwane and the rest of the team, to have a great week. Bye-bye.